but that's quite a lot if you're not. So yeah, there are quite a lot of short passages from people like Kafka, Beckett, Clarice Lispector, people like that, which can certainly contain a great deal of philosophical thought as well, or Borges. So I'll think that one through, but it will continue from this because you know, I'm quite pleased we've ended, or we're ending on emptiness and nothingness, because I'm quite partial to the void.
Yes.
And me and my friend Lucy, who I think some of you met because she came and gave a talk, have been working on this project about voidalism for a while. We invented this term. It's about the idea of nothingness in relation to law and art, specifically. But during the course of investigating the void, I mean, I got into the void initially through Western philosophy, but obviously Eastern philosophy has a different approach to it than nothingness. There is a prejudice generally in Occidental and Western philosophy against nothingness, which goes back probably to Aristotle. I mean, there were, if you look at people prior to Plato, like Heraclitus, it's arguably the case that there is a concept of nothingness around, but the concept of nothingness is ruled out by Aristotle, effectively. And this concept of nature abhors a vacuum came in. There's this idea that nothingness is impossible to conceive of. What is nothing? In any absolute sense. I mean, you could have a relative nothingness, I suppose, like there is nothing in the box. But that isn't the same as nothingness as such. Dan, go on.
I think it's worth mentioning that we didn't have the concept of the zero, and we didn't have that in Western maths at that time.
So yeah, so true. Yeah, I mean, Western mathematics ruled out the concept of zero, and then it came in as a sort of place marker, and merely that. Roman numbers don't have zero at all. But they realized that you have to have a place marker of zero if you're going to have really large numbers, because otherwise you end up with writing whole, you know, kind of pages of a single number, like the Romans did, in fact. So that's kind of crazy. But it was an aversion to the concept of zero. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And it's really interesting that East and West should diverge so much on this. Because in India, it's very clear they didn't have a problem with either the number zero or the concept of nothingness pervading. I mean, you guys probably know far more about this than I do, because I think some of you have delved quite heavily into Buddhism and Taoism and things. But the concept of sunyata in India, as I understand it, goes back at least 3,000 years, and it's written about for 3,000 years. I mean, do you know about this concept?
I've read about it.
Yep. Well, I mean, all right. I mean, Dan, you come from Taoism. Taoism has its own concept of nothingness, doesn't it? Wu or something. How would you describe Taoist nothing?
Well, I think they call it the void, really. So I suppose it'd have to be everything's yin and yang, either yin or yang, and when it reaches its fullness of either yin or yang, it turns into its opposite. So that's the black and the white in the circle. And the circle kind of contains everything. So its infinity is the same as nothing, really.
Right.
I think that's the way
So everything and nothing are the same thing?
I think so.
Well, that's another aspect of a lot of Eastern thinking, particularly China and Japan, is it deals in paradox constantly. Nagarjuna, who I mentioned, the Indian philosopher, he was around in about the 1st, 2nd century in our time AD. He claimed at one point something along the lines of samsara is the same as nirvana. Now, those of you who have some kind of notion of Buddhism will know that samsara is the world of illusion. It's the physical universe. It's all the things that we perceive in life. But from a Buddhist point of view, this is an illusion. Whereas nirvana is an escape from all that. It's an escape from the ego. It's an escape from desire. It's the ultimate enlightenment. And in traditional dogmatic Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, there is a notion that you have to reject the illusory universe. You have to distinguish yourself from it through meditation and other exercises for some considerable time until you're no longer troubled by all the things that it throws your way. You're no longer finding yourself desiring things in that world, or fearful of them even. You develop an absolute neutrality towards that world. Then you move to the next step where you dissolve your ego and the sense of self, which is the final illusion. And in traditional Buddhism, all that is the realm of samsara. And once you move beyond that, you enter, maybe ideally, if you're very lucky anyway, and you work hard, nirvana, or what the Hindu version is samadhi, which is a very curious state. It's very difficult to actually pin down in words, because as soon as you try to pin it down in words, of course, it's escaped. It's related to nothingness, but isn't nothingness. I mean, this is a kind of like a real caricature of a lot of Indian philosophy, obviously, but these ideas started to come over to the West, probably from about the 14th century onwards, through the Silk Road. The Italian merchants were traveling over to China. Marco Polo's Adventures describes this kind of process. And as you travel and as you exchange goods and services of various kinds, you know, taking Viking furs over to China in exchange for silks, which is what they did. You also have ideas traveling and linguistic patterns developing, which cope with the transmission of ideas as you go along. So there was undoubtedly some kind of exchange going on between East and West. But over the business of nothing, it never really translated until much, much later. What undoubtedly did come across is certain aspects of Indian and Chinese thinking. And this was particularly the case in Germany. For all kinds of complex reasons, German thinkers and philosophers from at least Leibniz onwards, Leibniz is 17th century, 1600s, were fascinated by Chinese and Indian thought. There was something in Indian thought that was felt to be lacking in Western thought, put it that way. In the age of reason, there was a massive emphasis on rationality, obviously, but there were also ontological questions rearing their heads all the time about existence. Ontology is concerned with what exists, not just about how rationality works and reason works and how that might determine how we think about what exists, but what exists full stop. And one of the fundamental questions Leibniz asked is, why is there something rather than nothing? This is a foundational question for a lot of Western thinking subsequently, which is personified in Heidegger in particular, but also permeates cosmological thinking now.
Sorry, Charlie.
Yeah.
Who did you say that said that?
Leibniz, Leibniz. Yeah, he's a contemporary of Descartes and Spinoza, same period. But he came up with this thing, why is there something rather than nothing? Which is a big question to ask. I mean, is there an answer to that question, do you think? Some would claim it's a meaningless question.
It's a complex one, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, we haven't got time to deal with the whole cosmology tonight. But well,
we've got all the rest of eternity, I suppose, haven't we, in some ways? Yeah. But I mean, in a way, it's fundamentally the same question that's being asked by cosmologists now about the Big Bang. You know, where did it all start? As far as our sciences are concerned, what, 13.8 billion years ago, something like that?
Don't they claim to have traced it back to something like 5 seconds?
Yeah, less.
Less is it now?
They know what's happened in the first billionth of a second.
Right, yeah.
And you know, but there's this big gap between about 10 seconds and about 150 million years, and they don't know what happened then.
But isn't there also
I don't know how they work that one out, but yeah.
Isn't there a new idea that there might have been something before the Big Bang?
Yeah. I mean, all these patterns of the universe, either it all started at once, time and space, matter, everything. In which case the question is always, well, what happened before that? In which case the answer is, well, there was no before that, which is really difficult for our minds to kind of really grasp and grapple with. It's hard for us to think of a point where time begins.
Well,
yeah, Karen.
So I think in sort of Chinese logic, there's a sort of a flux of dispersing and coagulating and dissolving, isn't there? So there is simultaneously everything and nothing. The only difference being transitory forms of everything and nothing, if that's not illogical.
Well, most mythological systems begin with the notion of chaos in one form or another. The idea of chaos where there is no order, and have this primary opposition between chaos and order, which obviously collates with Dionysius and Apollo in a different kind of way. But that's a fundamental opposition. Sometimes the chaos is represented as a primordial night of some kind. Sometimes it's connected to the sea. because the sea was obviously perceived as a place of birth, but a dangerous place that seemed chaotic to landlubbers, you know, when you're out there. But chaos is somehow tamed in one form or another. And there are a lot of different versions of that. And I think there was one Indian version. I'm trying to remember what it was, or was it Japanese? No, I can't remember exactly where it was. But there are lots and lots of examples of this, of some adventurer, some hero going back into the chaos to find wisdom and somehow extracting something which enables human beings to exist, some kind of supernatural being. So these kind of ideas in mythology and in philosophy are coming over to Europe, mainly via Germany, but also indirectly through Italy and France, and then in due course by the British, because of course the British went and conquered, as it were, large sections of India, and along with the imperial adventures that were going on there and the bureaucracy and the military side of it, there were scholars. Scholars went too. Scholars who were fascinated by the birth of language, by the evidence that Sanskrit seemed to be a primary language in a sense, and connected to some language before that, from which Latin, Hebrew, and all the other languages of the so-called civilized world at the time somehow evolved. So there was a great deal of talk and investigation about how language evolved from this language. And this was very mixed up with Christianity, the Christian idea of the being expelled from the Garden of Eden. And you know the origin of languages in the Old Testament. We touched on this before. You know, the Tower of Babel. This idea that there was an Adamic language. There was a primary language, which is the one that Adam was given by God, and through which Adam named all the creatures in the Garden of Eden, and hence in the world. And clearly Eve, as a secondary figure in this, absorbed Adamic language, and all their children spoke Adamic, until in that arrogance, and the arrogance of the architect Nimrod, who tried to build a tower to reach heaven, God was offended, and he blasted the tower in that extraordinary image which you still see on tarot cards and 9/11. And this actually scattered people all over the globe, and everybody started to babble, and hence Babylon, in different languages. So there was a perception in the West that there was an Adamic language, and a lot of people who went over to India and were looking at Sanskrit and other languages in the Far East, as it was then called, imagined that they could probably get back to this if they chased up all the different kind of features of these different linguistic systems. And in doing this and investigating language, of course, they were absorbing other things as well, culturally, and in particular philosophy. And so it's kind of interesting that Nietzsche, when he starts, is not a philosopher, he's a philologist. He's a man who studies language. That's how he begins. And his first job in Basel, his only real job, is as a professor of philology. Philology, like philosophy, is about language in a way, but it's specifically about words, sentences, grammar, syntax, and the history of and evolution of language and linguistic systems. Now, these two things are all mixed up in German intellectual culture at that time. So Nietzsche's absorption of Eastern thought comes partly from philology, because he was familiar with a lot of the arguments that are going on about in the background about Adamic languages, which had more or less been kind of rejected by that point, but was still there in the background, and the various philosophical principles that came with it. He was also picking up the interest that had been around for some time, a couple of hundred years by then, in Hinduism and Buddhism in particular, and to some extent in Chinese thinking, and especially through Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was a scholar of Eastern thought, and there's no doubt that Schopenhauer absorbed certain aspects of Buddhism and maybe Hinduism to some degree into his whole philosophy of the will. Remember, Schopenhauer has this whole idea that if, when we go back to Kant again, right, as you always have to, Kant divided everything that we can perceive, or everything that exists effectively and that we can know, into phenomena and noumena. Noumena were the real things in themselves. Phenomena was all the experience that we have of the universe, of ourselves, of everything. Phenomena is the world of appearances. We can't actually get to the noumena because our senses, our understanding, and our intellect shape this noumena into the phenomena that we exist in. So we can never actually access real reality in Kant's system. We only ever experience phenomena. The people who followed Kant in Germany, yeah, go on.
Can I just ask, what what kind of author would you suggest to read about theology?
Theology or philology?
Oh, what did you say?
When I talk about what language, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, if you read about the early Nietzsche, there's an awful lot in there, actually.
Okay, thank you.
There are probably quite specialist things on philology I don't actually know about, but if you read, the biography of Nietzsche, you know, that I sent that one out. I Am Dynamite. The early sections of that will tell you quite a lot about the philological background. There's also Umberto Eco, the Italian writer who wrote The Name of the Rose. He wrote a book, I think it's called In Search of the Perfect Language. It's either the title or the subtitle, and he talks about the pursuit of the Adamic language and the perfect language in there. So Umberto Eco is another one I would suggest. And he brings Kant into it, to go back to that. So anyway, you have noumena and phenomena and people getting dissatisfied with that. And people like Hegel and Schelling afterwards try to find ways to actually access reality. And Schopenhauer does through his concept of the will. Everything ultimately is this force that drives the universe. And it became perhaps clear to him at a certain point in his own worldview anyway, that there was a similarity between this concept of the will that just continues to persevere and recreate itself endlessly, and what the Buddhists call desire in various forms. Buddhism begins with the idea that the world, everything is suffering. All is suffering, but the majority of most people's lives is one form of suffering or another. And the next stage is to say that desire is the cause of suffering. It's the fact that we need, want, and desire that generates that suffering. So the other two noble truths are about how to deal with that, how to go beyond desire through the Noble Eightfold Path and perhaps eventually end up with nirvana, an escape from the wheel of suffering. And this idea of suffering was very important to Schopenhauer as well. He's called the philosopher of pessimism because he generally viewed that most human life was about suffering. And much of it was about the will and our relationship with the will. So his philosophy is about trying to find some way in which our individual sense of will can unite with this more general sense of will in a way that lessens the general suffering that he perceived in the universe. And he finds it specifically through art. And that seems to be the main way he does that. And this is what Nietzsche picks up on. So Nietzsche picks up in his early work on this Schopenhauerian notion of the will and the idea of the art as the release from this suffering. But he also obviously is reading back and reading up on Buddhism in particular at the same time. And because he's familiar with Leibniz, he'll be aware that Leibniz, some 150 years before, had been very interested in Chinese philosophy. And while he hadn't directly dealt with Taoism as such, he was a student of the I Ching, the Chinese Book of Changes, which people in the West still use as a kind of, analog of tarot. It's an Eastern version of that. They use it as a kind of divination tool. But for Leibniz, it was a mathematical object. So he was feeding those kind of ideas into German thinking as well. So Nietzsche picked up all these different things. This is like I'm just trying to position Nietzsche in relation to this at this stage. And there are elements of this, although he doesn't talk about it much directly, it's fairly evident, as a lot of scholars have picked up, that there are elements of this thinking coming through in his thinking too. His attitude towards the world as a kind of illusion in a sense, but one that you can create. So Nietzsche's attitude to Buddhism, when he started to develop his ideas a little bit more after the whole period of the birth of tragedy, was very much that Buddhism was a kind of nihilism. Right, so this is when we get back to nothing. The big problem for Nietzsche was nihilism. Bless you.
Could I just say something?
Yeah.
So I just want to mention this because something I want to talk about later.
Yeah.
This would be helpful if I say this now. And it's just that there are 3 martial arts in China that are based on Chinese philosophical ideas. So there's Tai Chi based on the Tai Chi diagram, the Yin Yang symbol. There's Bao Gua, which is based on the 8 trigrams I Ching symbol. And there's Xing Yi, which is based on 5-element theory, and which also has symbols. So I just want to say that because I want to come back to it later.
Yeah, well, I mean, all these systems are quite elaborately mathematical. I mean, that's as I perceive it anyway. And the other thing they've all got in common is this concept of chi, or however you want to pronounce it, which is equivalent to the elan vital in the West, or prana in India. This idea of some kind of life force that operates. So, I mean, that is relevant, yeah. But I think the problem of, I mean, it's only really when you get to the 20th century, the problem of nihilism starts to directly affect a lot of thinkers. And in the West, it's very much because of Nietzsche, towards the end of the 19th century, announcing this age of nihilism. The concept of nihilism goes back to a guy called Jacobi, who was responded to Kant's initial philosophy and described Kant as leading to a kind of nihilism. And at that point, nihilism just means belief in nothing.
Is that spelled with a J?
Sorry?
That's spelled with a J.
J. Yeah, Jacobi is spelled with a J. Jacob.
And where was he operating?
He would have been early 1800s.
Yeah, but whereabouts?
Oh, Germany. It's all happening
Okay.
in Germany. Yeah, all of this is going on in Germany. But no, the concept of nihilism is really interesting. It has its own history. Nihil is Latin for nothing. So it's a belief in nothingness, and it takes a lot of different forms. There's philosophical nihilism, there's political nihilism. Political nihilism fed into the anarchist movement in Russia, for example. And at that point, nihilists were generally chemists, because they didn't believe in all this kind of like religious stuff. They just believed in material stuff like chemistry. Turgenev, the writer's book Father and Sons, is all about that. Dostoevsky writes about nihilism, particularly in the book that's sometimes translated as The Possessed, sometimes as Demons. But also in the Brothers Karamazov, and that thing that I mentioned earlier, the Grand Inquisitor's speech is exemplary in that regard. And it, in a way, it describes Dostoevsky's crisis with the whole concept of Christianity and the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. And remember that this is Nietzsche's target as well. When Nietzsche first encounters Dostoevsky, he sees a brother in spirit, put it that way, because of Dostoevsky's deep critique of Judeo-Christian thinking. And this is obviously part of it as well, because a lot of people in the West are looking at the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is all about redemption. You know, you have a life, you behave in a certain way, and if God chooses, you go to heaven. If you behave badly or whatever, you go to hell, and in some cases purgatory. But it's a particular vision of life. You have to behave in a certain way, and then you get rewarded or punished after it. Whereas the Eastern tradition is very different in that regard. You know, there's this idea of the wheel of life. There's a constant sense of reincarnation in most traditions, not all of them. And you keep on repeating some kind of existence on this planet. And it might be based on karma, as it is in India. It might be based on something completely arbitrary. But they don't have this kind of linear story of eventual redemption in the East at all. In general, most Eastern religions, when you dig down to their philosophical core anyway, are about the fact that this universe that we're in is not a very good place to be, and the best thing to do is to try and escape from it one way or another, whether through nirvana or samadhi or whatever. So it's a very different kind of worldview. It's not about you know, behaving in a certain way and getting rewarded or punished. It's about trying to escape. I mean, is that fair? Do you think there's a caricature of what you know of Eastern religions?
I think in Taoism there's so many sects or paths or types of Taoism. That I think many of them do have saints, and they have an idea of an afterlife quite often.
I think, well, this is something that I think Karen was talking about, like the reality on the ground of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism is not the same as its pure philosophical dimension, is it? You know, I mean, you have Myanmar, it's a perfect example of that. You know, Buddhism in Myanmar is often extremely vicious, and it's a kind of police state, isn't it?
Now, today, I don't know if Karen wants to say something.
Go on.
Yeah, there's where to start. No, I shall leave it for now and just keep listening. Yeah, I think that the minute that okay, let's formulate a thought. Buddhist philosophy is anathema, because Buddhism is essentially a doing thing, not a labeling thing. Okay, which means that Buddhist philosophy is necessarily an expedient tool towards something. As such, it does echo this Western idea of trying to improve oneself for some kind of release or praise or reward.
Right.
So, you know, you could argue that they are not so different. There's okay, so Nietzsche had his necessary fiction, which is what we all require to cope with being in the world.
Yep.
Buddhism could be seen to be something akin to that. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
the question really is whether these. The question really is whether these are interim stages or not, and whether they lead somewhere or not, or whether they should just loop back on themselves and give you a new perspective on where you were all along.
I mean, it's kind of interesting that Buddha himself supposedly didn't like to talk about life and death and all this kind of stuff. He was very much about practice and about pursuing very single-mindedly this cessation of desire and this move to nirvana. And it's only after Gautama's death, of course, inevitably, that you get the various schools systematizing Buddhist thought and turning it into dogma, just as you do in Christianity, Islam, whatever. And it seems to me that all the major world religions have tended towards this orthodoxy and this very conservative kind of hierarchy, because there's some sort of human imperative that drives people to behave like that, regardless of what the supposed content of a religious message is. You behave in a way that protects that message, but doesn't necessarily practice it in any degree. And the Grand Inquisitor's speech in Dostoevsky is a perfect example of that, where this guy who's in the Inquisition famously torturing and burning people to death as heretics because they deviate slightly from the Vatican's message, is asked how he'd deal with Jesus Christ, the Messiah, reappearing. And in the end, it turns out the Inquisitor would have had him tried for heresy and tortured and burnt. And, you know, it's very obvious what Dostoevsky's point is there, but it's a powerful truth of almost every religion, I would think, or if not all of them. But at the same time, there's always been a strand or two in almost all these religions which has rebelled against this dogma and retained that original, arguably mystical current. You get it in Christianity with the mystics like Meister Eckhart, who Nishitani, the Japanese philosopher, drew on quite heavily, or Julian of Norwich and St. John the Divine. You know, Christianity has plenty of mystics who rejected all this stuff, rejected the church and pursued a different path. Islam has Sufism, which does something quite similar. And I'm sure there are elements within Buddhism and Hinduism and quite possibly Shinto and Taoism as well that try and retain that pure core. But the danger there is, of course, there are all these other people who are looking for purity in religion who become fundamentalists in one form or another. So in a sense, from my perspective anyway, the thing is to disentangle the philosophical elements from these religious systems and separate them completely from the religious expression, which is something else. There's a lot of value from the philosophy of this season thinking. Dan?
Can I talk about Buddhism for a minute or two?
Go on, yeah.
When I first heard about Buddhism, I was attracted to it. And I sort of discovered it, as you mentioned, the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering, I'm part of life, so I'm suffering, but there is a way out. And the way out is the Eightfold Path, which you mentioned. So I thought, well, this is good, this is worth exploring. And a bit later on, I used to go to the Buddhist Centre when it used to be in Lewis Road, just off Lewis Road. And the guy who started that, Sangharakshita, a little while ago got done for a lot of sexual abuse, didn't he?
Oh, did he? Yeah.
And people weren't meant, like a lot of gurus, people just weren't speaking openly about it. Anyway, that's beside the point. So anyway, I used to go to the Buddhist Centre. So what was attracting me was it seemed like the simplicity of it. Just meditate and you might be enlightened, and you might, you know, achieve nirvana or whatever, and enlightenment at least,
Maybe.
And then anyway, so I started reading some of the sutras, and the Buddha had a sort of particularly favoured disciple, I think, called Avalokitesvara. I don't know how you pronounce that. Have you heard of this guy? Anyway, there's lots of stories about the Buddha. He it seemed like he would say something, and then he would look around, and one of his followers, usually this Avalokitesvara, whatever it is, would have a look in his eye, and the Buddha would realise he'd understood his words. And for that reason, he kind of cultivated a special relationship. Anyway, so reading all that stuff, and then start to read about how Buddhism went to China in the 5th century, where it eventually sort of merged with the existing Taoism and some other sort of ideas that were floating about, and became Chan, which later went to Japan and became Zen. So at the point, what was the point? So I might as well get this out of the way. Have we got to limit ourselves to talking about the East tonight?
No.
Right, because what it is, so I realise I've actually known you quite a while now, because I met you back in the first year of FUB.
Yeah.
You were doing a course based on Umberto Eco's, I think, where we were
I
looking
can't
at
remember now.
we were looking at art and saying why it was.
Oh yeah, it was about art, wasn't it? Yeah, that's right.
Why it was beautiful, and if it was
Yeah,
beautiful.
The good, the bad, and the beautiful.
That's right, which I later found out actually was obviously we know it's a play on the Sam Peckinpah film.
Not Sam Peckinpah, no, Enrico Morricone.
Yeah, no, he wrote the music. Morricone.
No, not the music. Sierra Leone.
That's it.
Leone, yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So, but I later found out there's a philosophical work called "The Good, the Beautiful, and the Something Else," which I thought you must be aware of, and that was.
I don't know offhand, but I can believe it. Maybe it was by me. I don't know.
Maybe. Anyway, I digress. So, when I came to that, towards the end of it, what I liked about it was it wasn't just pure philosophy. It had a sort of direction where we were looking at particular things, saying what we thought about them and why, and that kind of helped because of we had something concrete. It's easier to formulate ideas.
Yeah. Well, in that case, it was art. Yeah, and then I was doing ethics, and then gradually, I was gradually working through these ideas myself. And then the good life, and then. I've
kind of picked up on that a bit, I think, and. I remember very much near the end, you sort of went back and started talking about Plato and the cave, and because this was after we'd looked at Duchamp and reproducibility photographs and stuff, and then you went back to that and started talking about copies of copies of copies.
Simulacra,
yeah, and that struck a chord with me because I had recently reread. Well, not all of, but chunks of Simulacra and Simulacrum, which is about, as you know, copies of copies. And you can see that antecedents of that in Plato and the cave and some other stuff of antiquity. And then, so because I started off originally, I didn't start, but Guy Debord was always in the back of my mind. Anyway, so I went away from that with the copies of copies, and then I sort of did a lot of internet searches, and I'm still thinking, and copies of Simulacra and Simulacrum, and then so over these years I've done more courses with you and others, and done my own reading and stuff. And
so are you saying this all connects to like a circle?
What I'm trying to say is, I think towards the first half before we had the break, I had a sort of moment where I got up and went, "Oh, that's it," and sort of realization of something. And then when I watched the recording, I could sort of say it was something to do with time, but I couldn't pin it down, to be honest. That made me think Heraclitus was right about,
Right, no, okay, look, I'll stop you there. Like, just going into this another way, space and time, and getting it to, philosophy as such. There's this concept in some Western thinking, but it also applies to these, called the Quasi Object. You get it in Michel Serres, who we haven't actually studied, but analytic philosophy talks about it. And the Quasi Object is like not a physical object, but it has a physical kind of power, something like the equator or the North Pole. Maybe the North Pole, but the equator doesn't actually exist, or does it? I mean, does the equator exist, or is it just, what is it? Is it a fiction? It's not quite the same as Bugs Bunny. It's not on the same ontological level as Bugs Bunny either, is it?
Well, we can say the North Pole exists, can't we?
You can say the magnetic pole exists, I suppose, but it's not the same as the North Pole, is it?
No.
And what about the Big Bang? Is that a real thing in space and time? No, it isn't, because it's prior to space and time. There are all these things, quasi objects, which are, they have a spatio-temporal kind of, we indicate them spatio-temporally, but we don't create them in the way we do fictions, because something like the equator actually does have an effect on our ability to travel around the world. Latitude, longitude does affect the way in which we move. We needed clocks and chronometers to be able to navigate in relation to the stars. Something like 3 o'clock doesn't actually exist, but the concept of 3 o'clock has power in our everyday lives.
3 o'clock existed before we had clocks.
Well, did it?
Well, it must have done, mustn't it?
No.
It didn't have.
I mean, look, there was no Wednesday before human beings came along. Was there?
See, now this is getting all nicely empty, to use a Buddhist term, really. I was listening to what Dan said, and I was thinking I've left this way long ago, but my brief sojourn into Buddhism, as soon as I started asking questions, the teacher said, no, you're not to ask any questions, you're not to do any reading, and you're not to expect enlightenment.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really good advice, and I briefly shut up. And I was told just to go be an empty vessel.
The Zen Buddhists are really into that stuff, aren't they? And they're whacking you as well.
I mentioned the sort of the empty vessel. This is another idea, isn't it? Does the vessel exist, or is it just, this is just a term that we use to try and describe the empty? There has to be something.
We find emptiness very difficult to deal with.
But the minute we talk about something being contained, then it has a form, and how can emptiness have a form, and round you go. So, it is one of those ideas that is both nothing and something. It has profundity and it has meaning, like 3 o'clock, but equally it's just something that we made up.
Well, yeah, there's nothing made up. This is it. Does nothing exist? What does it mean to make the statement nothing exists?
Well, nothing is nothing to worry about.
Well, nothing to worry about is slightly different, isn't it? If you say nothing exists, that's quite a big statement. It could mean various things, I suppose. It either means nothing exists, or it means nothing exists. And they're different nothingness. Nothing.
This was the nihilism thing, isn't it? Belief in nothing. Is it that you have a belief in something that is nothing, or do you not have a belief?
Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche calls this the will to nothing, because Nietzsche holds on to this concept of the will to power, and this is what Nishitana criticizes him for, which we'll get to in the second half. But the will always want to will, and if it can't will something, it will nothing, according to Nietzsche. And this is where Schopenhauer ended up.
I think that
Alan?
oh, sorry.
Yeah, go on, Alan.
I think, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm just reflecting on what you're saying, and I just thought that maybe when one kind of perceives the idea of nothing, that it's a kind of a space that doesn't move. So maybe to get away from that would be to kind of see space as something that's moving.
Moving space. And that's an interesting concept. I mean, are you talking about moving emptiness? Can emptiness move around?
That's what I mean, that everything moves, and that might help get away from the idea of like nothingness.
The universe is expanding, isn't it?
Apparently. Yeah.
It won't go on forever.
And it's expanding at far faster than the speed of light as well.
Eventually, it will reach its full yang potential and become its opposite, which is yin.
Well, I mean, that's one theory, the theory that the universe expands to a certain point, then suddenly contracts again. It's called the big crunch, isn't it? Yeah. So it stretches out and then goes back to the beginning, and then stretches out again and goes back to the beginning. Anyway, like a pulsating blob.
I wanted to finish my thought on Buddhism and then move away from it, because what happened was, so I discovered Buddhism, and then I like the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and going to the meditation class, and I was getting on with that and doing a bit of yoga. And then I discovered there were all these sutras, and they're all contradictory, and they're all quite dense and demand a lot of study. And then it started to seem like the Bible that I'd kind of given up on. You know, just to begin with, it seemed like a simple thing. You just follow these simple rules, and maybe you can find, you know, something in yourself that is good, or that is helpful to you. And then I didn't find it, so I moved. Then I forgot all about it, carried on doing yoga. But then when I eventually read the Tao of Physics, around the same time I knew this bloke was into Chinese martial arts. And I started getting into them. Then I discovered that the yin yang and the Bagua and the five element medical theory were all sort of interlinked.
Well, they are. But no, if you're going to pursue the nothingness that someone like Nagarjuna and
Charlie, I'm actually bringing this to a point.
Okay, go on. So get to the point.
Okay, but you know, I can't just get to the point without bringing this into it. So, so I happen to be looking at something today. It reminded me of something I'd completely forgotten from ages ago. I think in the 90s, this kind of got into the culture, the wider culture. A fragment had been found of something Nietzsche had written. After he died, they were looking through his stuff, and he had written, "I've forgotten my umbrella."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Just a scrap of paper, and it was found. And scholars pored over it, trying to decide, was it profound? Did it mean anything? What did it mean? And Derrida wrote a sort of humorous book about this, which sort of slim volume, which actually got into the, let's say, mainstream media, broadsheet newspaper territory. Anyway, that's just how I knew about it. I'm not a philosopher.
I put it up 2 weeks ago. Spurs. I put it up.
Did you really? That's amazing. I didn't see that. Oh, well, that's weird.
Well, it's all about what the truth is. Truth of woman. I mean, the basic idea is a a minor footnote of Nietzsche. What value does it have? And a lot of that is about the will to power, because this whole book was his notes. It was never finished as a book. Yeah. And yet people like Heidegger based a great deal on it. So Derrida is kind of probing that. At what point do we decide whether something's important or isn't? In terms of statements.
Yeah, I've not read the book, but I've read.
But look, we need to get back to nothingness, then. We're moving to umbrellas. I mean, umbrellas have probably got something to do with nothingness. Well, I want to go back to nothingness before we have a break. And one thing I do want to think about is like what these belief systems mean, because if you're going to pursue the kind of Nietzscheanism that someone like Nishitani certainly pursued or tried to, and arguably Nagarjuna, 2000 years, nearly 2000 years before Nietzsche, what they did was they confronted nihilism in the same way that Nietzsche claimed he was doing, to confront this absolute nothingness, to find some way to move beyond it, which in Nietzsche's case was the amor fati, or the eternal recurrence. This is the essential thing, and to do that, you got to dissolve these belief systems, yin and yang, even. But I mean, so many of the belief systems in the world now. The I word that came up last week, Karen, indigenous. So many new age thinkers are delving into versions of animism now, what we call animism, the belief in, the existence of spirits all over the place, and very often very kind of like commodified versions of mythological systems from around the world. So there is a will to believe that really drives a lot of people. to what end? Nietzsche would claim this is a kind of nihilism, of passive nihilism. What we need is an active nihilism, which is willing to confront the complete meaninglessness of everything and the complete emptiness of everything, and to try and absorb oneself into that emptiness and almost become nothing yourself. This is the hardest thing to do, but it is the most authentic thing to do in that sense. So, you know, anybody, I mean, you know, is that right? Is that right? Yeah.
I think that in order to do that, one would have to kind of accept absolute knowledge, like, and just kind of obliterate mystery. And because I think, like, as long as you have mystery, then you're going to have something, you know. So
well, is mystery a good thing or a bad thing then?
Well, I mean, I was listening to Heidegger earlier, and he talked about phenomenology, and the behind the phenomenon is really nothing, you know. So even no matter what we perceive or don't or can't get a grasp on, really behind that there isn't really anything there. So
that's something that comes from the Nietzschean tradition, the idea of necessary fictions. You can view the world as just appearances, and there are people who've taken that view, that everything is just phenomena. Nothing has any intrinsic reality beyond that phenomena, you know. And I mean, you know, you can live in that world if you want, but there's something for a lot of people deeply unsatisfying about that. Human beings seem to want more, which is why they invest so much in these extraordinarily complex belief systems, like, you know, the Trinity in Christianity, for example, or the multitude of different New Age faiths, you know. And so the question fundamentally is, what is the value of these belief systems ultimately? Are they just ways for human beings to make themselves feel better, kinds of therapy? Or are we pursuing some intrinsic reality here?
Well,
Karen?
I was reading what Karen posted about animalism in a private message to me, and just before I came on to Zoom, and I've just started reading a story, and to me it sounds like it's about bringing humans together, like you mentioned this, like a bit earlier in this seminar, but it's kind of like that kind of will to be together as humans. And I think one word that she used was kingship, and I think that animalism has that ability to have a kind of bringing together, like and they also talk about it being more than human, so it's not just humans at the top sort of thing. Yeah,
there are versions of it like that. Yeah. I mean, animism is a general term for the idea that there's a force of consciousness in nature, which can manifest in various ways, like the Japanese idea of kami, which you see in those Ghibli cartoons, you know, that there are spirits of the trees, spirits of the tree post, spirits of the door, very much like Roman religion. You know, whenever you went to a door, you had to pay obeisance to about 20 different gods. There was the spirit of the door knocker, the spirit of the letterbox, the spirit of this, that, and the other, you know. It's a complicated world to live in, the world of animism, but maybe there's some intrinsic satisfaction which is based on community, like you say. You have a collective belief system, and this brings people together in some way, and perhaps the value of it is that. But there's something about a lot of religious and philosophical consciousness in humans that aspires to something more than that. This is the problem. You can call it the will to truth, or faith, or a search for reality, all these different things. And I mean, the fundamental question of nihilism, is it actually worth doing? Is it worth pursuing these things ultimately? Karen?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it relevant. Adam was talking about knowledge, and I had it in my head, following on from what you said about how we sort of generate order out of nothing. We don't like the void, the vacuum. The Buddha, you know, the one that we always talk about, he was insistent on his death that it wasn't about him and no images should be made of him. Within a couple of 100 years, not only were there images of him, but there were a whole series of rules about how he was to be portrayed. Yeah. Right, so that sort of encompasses a lot of what you were talking about. And then there are all these sort of bodies of knowledge that he wouldn't have approved of. as well. So I've written knowledge as rules, and the ordering is creating something out of nothing, because we're so uncomfortable with nothing. And the relationship of Nietzsche to Buddhism as a thing you do, not as a series of lists and philosophies, is about the reevaluation of all values, or the disordering of all orders.
Yeah. One of the fundamental problems in a way with that is, like, when Nietzsche claimed that the way beyond nihilism was the reevaluation of all values, which he did, which is like to take the evaluating function and run with it individually. As Heidegger pointed out, it's a bit like putting out a fire with gasoline or something worse to that effect, because you're trying to get beyond nihilism by creating something new behind which there is nothing. So you're actually not achieving what you intend to achieve. And this is the point that Nishitani picks up as well. And in a sense, it goes back to Nagarjuna, who talks about two kinds of truth. This is a very Buddhist idea, that you have conventional truth, which is the truth of our everyday discourse, of our communities, how we manage with necessary fictions or whatever, or it could be science. And then you have ultimate truth. And the problem with ultimate truth is it can only be approached through conventional truth, because language is inadequate to this ultimate truth. And this ultimate truth for him is the emptiness, sanyata, beyond being a nothingness. And this is the point at which Nagarjuna, Nishitani, and quite a few Zen thinkers, arguably Taoist thinkers, I don't know that much about it, but also some Western thinkers like Maurice Blanchot, who we've never covered, have this idea that there is a nothingness beyond nothingness, almost, a non-existence behind being a non-being, which is ignored largely in the West, with a few exceptions, some Nietzscheans perhaps. And so it's quite a mind-blowing idea, I think, the nothingness beyond being a non-being. And then a distinction is made by Nishitani between emptiness and nothingness, which he then blurs a little bit later. Emptiness comes from the Indian Buddhist tradition, sunyata, whereas nothingness comes from the Taoist tradition, according to Nishitani, and it's variously called wu or mu, from whence we get the word meontology, which is like ontology, the study of being, but about the study of nothingness, mu. So you have mu and sunyata. Sunyata is emptiness, mu is nothingness. And so many of the debates that the Kyoto school engaged in at a certain stage were about the distinction between these two things, which may seem completely oblique and maybe, arguably maybe semantics, I don't know. But is there a difference between emptiness and nothingness? If you think about it in English, do you think there is or not?
I think there may be some sort of emptiness in aminalism, because it talks about how it's kind of sometimes you get these cognitive kind of spirits, and yep. I think in order to kind of like they talk about decolonializing, in order to decolonialize, maybe just as a suggestion, that you would need that emptiness in order to make the changes, like, because within that emptiness there is those kind of you're not absorbing the cognitive spirits of such sort.
I mean, that's right. There's an emptiness, to me, tends to suggest some sort of containment, like the empty vessel. Like you have an empty page, but you still have the page bounded in some way. You have an empty bottle or an empty glass, but there's still the shape of the glass. Nothingness is something more than that in a way. Nothingness is everything.
Emptiness is a something that gets dissolved into nothing, but it comes from something.
Yeah, it comes from something.
Always. That's it's not the same as nothingness at all, to my mind.
No. I mean, this is something that comes through with Plato. He talks a lot about, and Timaeus in particular, about forms, about form and content, and the shaping of nothingness into something. And he uses the example of the potter, a ceramicist on a kiln, for example. When you shape a pot, you're shaping a pot around an emptiness. Now, as far as we're concerned, it isn't a complete emptiness. We know there's air there, and the pursuit of the vacuum is something that obsessed Western thinking.
sorry, I think that language is a form. Like, I don't think language is empty or nothing. I think that language has an ability to transform one's reality, you know, one's like, you know, and for an act of listening isn't just a passive thing, it's an actual transformation.
There are elements of emptiness in language as well, like the space between words, for example, or the concept of silence, which is actually quite a big deal for certain Christian traditions. You know, what is silence about? Yeah.
I've just written the term negative space, which relates to both silence and your pottery thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, there's a science fiction book called that. I think about it. Yeah. I mean, it's actually, this relates back to Taoism as well. Sorry, Karen.
And art, creativity is a way out of suffering. Visual art requires negative space. Yeah.
Creativity and the void, I think, are really related. And if we maybe if I do this other course, we'll do Blanchot, because Blanchot does write about that through the myth of Orpheus. That creativity is a certain relationship to the void. But there is something in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching, and the 11th book. It's all about wheels and hubs and spaces. And I mean, I don't know if you've read this. I mean, Dan, I'm sure has, but you know, it is very much about the way in which wheels and spokes revolve around an empty center in some way. And they function by virtue of that nothingness in the heart of it. But it's very, very odd. It's very hard to understand. I'm not sure I understand it really. Nothingness in its pure sense, as absolute nothingness, means non-existence completely. And the question of existence is important here. Nagarjuna, when he's talking about non-existence, about nothingness, makes it clear when he's challenged that he isn't just talking about non-being. He's talking about what we in the West will call substance. The idea that, say, the soul exists and lasts forever, or God exists and lasts forever. These are kind of substances in the universe. What he's interested in is existence in itself. Existence doesn't have to have any objects. This is a really strange idea, but the idea of existence in itself with no objects attached to it. So you could have a nothingness, a whole universe of nothingness that in some way existed. That's quite hard for us to grasp, I think.
But that's part of the origin myth, isn't it? That you hear in Buddhism, like the Monkey King, if you remember the fantastic 70s teleprogram of Monkey.
Yeah, I remember Monkey, yeah.
That starts off with this origin that says, in the beginning there was primal chaos.
Right.
And the primal forces came together to create first one lump of island in the void and then another, until the world was made. And out of that sprang Monkey, whose spirit was irrepressibility. And because he couldn't behave, they shoved a mountain on him for a few 100,000 years. So that's the sort of origin of the world and of Monkey, and of the relationship between solidity and irrepressibility. And it basically talks about the unstoppable force and the immovable object.
Right.
But the point is that something came from nothing. That there was nothing, then there were forces.
This is the one thing that a lot of Western thinking couldn't accept from Aristotle onwards.
No, I know. Yeah.
You couldn't have something coming from nothing. I mean, it's in Shakespeare and King Lear's the lines with Cordelia, "Nothing shall come of nothing." But now we know that's not the case at all. You know, if you look at the quantum level of particle physics, virtual particles are flashing in and out of existence constantly. So something is coming from nothing all the time, it seems. And the only reason we can understand this is through mathematics, and it's beyond me, this mathematics. I don't understand it at all, but it gets translated for us, and this is what's actually going on. So there is a primal nothing behind something out there.
Well, assuming that you have the kind of faith in science that means that you believe in all things quantum despite not being able to do the maths to reassure yourself that there's something in it.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll have a break and then get onto quantum nothingness afterwards. If people are into that. Yeah, sound all right?
Yeah, I do remember saying to you at that first class that I had listened to Will Self going around the CERN and being shown the Large Hadron Collider.
Oh, CERN.
Yeah, and talking to all these scientists, explaining it all to him. And at the end, he said, "Well, everything you've just told me, I could be talking to a medieval pope.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
It's true. Yeah.
so,
And we're back with the medieval, the Middle Ages never ended, really.
all right, see you in 10 minutes.
Yeah, see you in 10 minutes.
How's your essay going then, Dan?
I haven't done any more of it.
Fair enough. Have you thought about what field interests you?
Oh, I'm going to pursue that particular.
The linguistics.
Well, to begin with, yeah, I'm going to. My first plan is. So I sent the video to my cousin, linguist cousin Rob, and I haven't heard. He said he'd have a look at it, and he hasn't. Or if he hasn't, got back to me. So what I'm going to do is send in the essay, and then just ask him if he's got any comments on that. Because it's a lot. He'll be the holidays soon, because he's teaching in York. He's back in York, and he's teaching there. But it'll be holidays time soon, won't it?
Yeah.
So I thought I might wait till then. I might send it to him and say, no rush, get them when you get down to it. But what I just want to sort of get his sort of linguistic sort of view on a sort of philosophical question.
So in 10 words or less, what does your essay contain? Is it a summary of the video, like the bit that I saw, or is there some...
Did I not send it to you? I thought I sent it to you.
No, you gave me what you called an abstract.
Right, it's more of a précis, really. So that's what I want to develop.
What is?
What I sent you.
Yeah.
My cousins who give me some ideas on how I may go about developing it. So you suggested, I think, socio.
Oh yeah, it's structuralism.
Yeah, because I've heard Rob talk about socio, so that seems like a good, the obvious place to begin. But I've been very busy with the Nietzsche stuff.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed. I put up what I did. I copied and pasted an extra like program notes from a Radio 4 program, and I pasted that up, and then I linked it to a Gil Scott Heron short video.
White is on the moon.
Did you listen to it?
Well, I know it backwards.
You know it
Done
backwards.
bit my sister Nell, and White is on the moon. Her legs and arms begin to swell, and White is on the moon.
I thought you might know that, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
But I was trying to contrast it with, and so was the program. But I thought, well, people might not watch the program, but they might read the notes and listen to the
The bit that I saw was, it didn't appear to be notes from the radio. It appeared to be you saying, is this resentment?
That was I just put that in at the beginning. The rest of it was program notes. But I
don't remember them.
Yeah, it was quite a long program note. But I put that in at the beginning because, you could read it as, well, this is just people, the weak complaining about the strong.
Yeah.
Or complaining about the rich. And of course it is, but also,
I'm looking now, Dan, at the Nietzsche forum, and there's about 6 lines of you saying resentment or righteous indignation, Elon Musk, move to Mars, Muskism, but there's nothing that seems to be from a radio show.
I didn't get, it's posted on I'll post it again. So I don't know what happened there. It was on my screen now. It was readable, so I don't know why it isn't now.
Why does Elon Musk believe he can save the world? PayPal, Elon Musk, SpaceX. Yeah, it's all Elon Musk stuff. It doesn't sound like a radio show. Well, I assumed that it was you.
No, so maybe I should have made that clear. But I just thought, perhaps, I suppose I thought people would read that and realise they haven't seen the program. If you haven't seen the program, you won't understand that. I see that now. So thanks for pointing that out.
What's the program though?
It was on Monday. I think it might be at about 11 o'clock. So if you want to check it out, it's on Sounds, isn't it? They call it.
But what is it? What's it called? What was it about?
It's probably called. Well, if you look at.
Is it about Elon Musk?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not just about Elon Musk. It's also about Jeff Bezos.
Yes. Okay. Understood.
Branson apparently isn't going out of he's not going into outer space. He's only going as far as, can't remember the name of it now.
I'll stick with the Gil Scott Heron then. That's fine by me.
Right.
Oh, hang on. What's Elon Musk got to do with resentment?
So there's a Radio 4 program on Monday. Right. It's all about rich men going into space.
Oh, yeah.
Did you hear it?
No, I didn't know, but I can imagine.
It's quite interesting sort of debate about how they, what their plans are, and Is it, is it at the expense of the environment here and stuff like that? And then it occurred to me that, and at the end they played this great Gil Scott Heron tune, White is on the Moon.
Oh yeah, I know.
So I posted it up.
Yeah.
As Cameron's just pointed out, it doesn't make much sense if you haven't seen the programme.
No, I know what you mean.
I thought it would.
Well, it's a good point. Are these people like these, extremely rich billionaire men running away from a dying planet? Are they like rats leaving a sinking ship?
And they caused all the problems.
Yeah.
Well, just them,
but it's definitely the billionaires among us are determined to survive one way or another.
And they're all. The other thing they're doing is building bunkers, isn't it?
I suppose that takes us conveniently into that other thing I said we should probably look at, like Nietzsche and the Earth. Nietzsche does talk a lot about the Earth. So our relationship with the void is one thing, but our relationship with the planet or the Earth is another. Is the Earth the same as the planet? Is the planet the same as the world? Is there a Nietzschean relationship to the Earth in 2021?
What was that term for concepts? The quasi objects.
Quasi objects.
Yeah, that's the world is a quasi object, isn't it?
Well, at the beginning of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, is the world is all that is the case. That's the first thing, which is quite brilliant in a way. You can think about that a lot, and he's got a good point there. The world is all that is the case. So is the world everything? I suppose we would say now the universe or the multiverse even. But the concept of the world is like a quasi object. It has power. Whereas the planet and the Earth are more real, I think. I don't know.
There is something, I do not know its name, I call it doubt.
There is that.
That's another way, that's a sort of quite similar to the Wittgenstein, isn't it? I can see
maybe it's more like Descartes. I don't know.
So all of this is representations, isn't it?
Well, that would be Schopenhauer, and possibly Wittgenstein. But I mean, there's a point being made here about if we have a relationship to something like the void, which is maybe a quasi object, or maybe not, because does a void have a spatio-temporal location?
Yeah, but aren't we taking an idea, the void, and then saying it exists? How do we know the void exists? Where is this void?
We don't.
How can we?
Well, in that sense, you're saying the void is on the same kind of ontological level as a unicorn. Like, you assume a unicorn doesn't exist. Maybe a unicorn does.
I think we know a unicorn doesn't exist because no one's ever seen one, never been bitten by one.
That doesn't prove they don't exist just because you've never seen one, Dan.
Well, it means they don't exist on this planet, on this plane.
As far as you know.
We can safely say that, I think. I mean, there may be a planet full of unicorns. I can't speak to that, but.
Well, analytic philosophers are quite obsessed with unicorns. If you read analytic philosophy, you find unicorns constantly gambling across the pages.
Well, so leavers, Brexiteers.
But I mean, I guess, all right, you're saying like a unicorn is a fictional entity. The void might be a fictional entity, but I mean, Karen, I think is suggesting it's a quasi object. It's somewhere between the two. What Henri Corbin, the French Islamicist, called the imaginal realm. It's not quite imagination, but it's not quite real too. It's some kind of interim. So I mean, maybe the void does have a kind of causal effect on us. Nothingness presumably does, or does it? I mean, does nothingness in any way change anything in our everyday lives, or is it sufficiently abstract not to be part of our everyday lives?
Yeah, it's sufficiently abstract that we can ignore it, but we will be ignoring it with our mind, which is also a quasi-conceptual something and nothing thing, isn't it?
The mind, yeah, the mind, the emptiness of the mind. Well, emptiness is a different thing, all right? You can talk about an empty kettle. You're going to make a cup of tea. You fill the kettle. So you have a notion of filling emptiness. So there is clearly a distinction between emptiness and nothingness in that sense. But in the Indian sense of sunyata, as far as I understand it, which of course it is translation, this concept of emptiness is one that extends into absolute nothingness. And these two terms, the different versions of emptiness and nothingness in you know, in Gujarati and the Punjabi, and then in various Chinese languages and Japanese, are constantly battling it out, and sometimes merging and becoming the same thing, and sometimes not.
The concept is that the emptiness is useful, as in a glass or a kettle or cup.
It has a causal power.
It has a use, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We can utilize it.
Whereas the void doesn't.
So, I mean,
Nothingness.
for me, the Taoist thinking is very practical. It's not. It says right at the beginning there's something that you can't know everything. It admits that right on page 1. There's something I do not know its name. I call it Tao. There are different interpretations, different translations, but there's one that was can't think of it now. I'll come back to it. So we can't know everything, but what we can know can be useful to us or not useful to us. So the difference between, for me, I find that Chinese martial arts and Qigong, which is a sort of medical, it's kind of mixed up with martial arts and traditional medical theory. That is all of practical value to me that I can use in my everyday life.
But in things like, in areas like that, I mean, you're talking about, right, emptiness, you might be talking about stillness or silence as well. You know, the moment at which you pull back the bow and there's a point of maximum tension, which is a kind of stillness before it's loosed. That's Zen and the art of archery and all that kind of stuff, which you also get in martial arts, obviously, and other mystical traditions as well. And there's presumably some relationship between stillness, silence, and emptiness, in as much as they all partake of a notion of absence, temporary absence, momentary absence of some kind.
But all of these descriptions that Dan was describing, all of these attempts that we're making to describe that point of tension in the bow and everything else, would Nietzsche not have come along and said, we need to reevaluate all of your attempts to pin stuff down and give it meaning?
Yeah, I'm sure. But I mean, you know, if he'd really pushed it that far, he's constantly falling into paradox whenever he tries to do that. I mean, perhaps inevitably. That's the thing. I mean, you know, he does fall into paradox and he skirts around it. Whereas in Zen, you're allowed it. You're allowed to be paradoxical. It's accepted. But what he does, I think, bequeath. Sorry.
How was he with paradox? Was he comfortable with being?
He plays with it. I mean, it's like there's a part of Nietzsche who's a poet and a rhetorician, so he plays with paradox sometimes. But one example of the way he seems to develop this idea, and it's certainly picked up on by Nishitani, is in Zarathustra, where he talks about the camel, the lion, and the child, the famous imagery of this transition. Whereas the camel exists in a world of kind of passive nihilism, effectively, just doing what it's told. It's a beast of burden. The lion exists in a state of slightly more active nihilism. You know, God is dead and the will to truth has dominated. This is about power and the exercise of power. Whereas the child is something else. The child is innocent. The child is play. The child is pure becoming. And there's a kind of transition there. The child can deal with paradox. The child can deal with contradiction and play with it. It's a playfulness. And the child would view paradox as a play of forces in the world of power, in some sense. And this is something that Heidegger picks up on, which is directly related to this. In terms of the void, there are some nothingnesses or emptinesses which are useful to us. And those of you that did a bit of Heidegger with me or whoever will remember possibly the idea of Vorhanden and Zuhanden, that all the objects in the world are either just there or they're ready to hand. You know, objects that are Vorhanden are just exist in the world as background. When they become Zuhanden, we can use them for something, right? So you pick up a rock on the ground. If it's just there, it's a rock. If you pick it up and use it to bash an enemy or something like that, it becomes useful to you. And emptiness has that capacity. You can create emptiness within a vessel of some kind. Heidegger has a lot of time talking about pots and stuff like that, or a pair of shoes. You know, the emptiness within those kind of objects make them ready to hand, Zuhanden. They're of use to us in some way. But then he talks about a kind of emptiness which is not that. It's beyond it. It's prior to it. And this is where you get into the realm of nothingness.
You're talking about Heidegger now.
Yeah. And this is what Sartre draws from Heidegger when he writes his own book, Nothingness. Heidegger calls it time, but he talks about the being towards death. And this is the big nothingness for Heidegger, because death is a curious thing for philosophy, for philosophers generally. You know, as Wittgenstein said, you cannot inhabit your own death. As soon as you think about it, you are objecting yourself from it. You can't experience your own death, or not being dead anyway, in that philosophical perception of things. But that actually defines what it is to be alive and what death means. We are thrown into this universe, thrownness as they call it in existentialism. Our egos filter everything in the universe so that we are the center of the universe, each of us. As far as we're concerned, we're completely the center of the universe. The more distant things are from us, the less they bother us. So if we suffer, the suffering is the center of the universe suffering. When we die, the universe dies, effectively. The universe ceases to exist. And it's the relationship with that absolute nothingness as far as the ego is concerned that Heidegger picks up on from Nietzsche, I think. And this becomes central to existential thinking subsequently. What is our relationship to that absolute nothingness that is our experience of the possibility of a non-existence?
What is the relationship of the Dionysian with all of this talk of nothingness?
I mean, the Dionysian seems to be more directly related to chaos than nothingness in a way, but I don't know. I suppose it depends on what the relationship between chaos and nothingness might be.
Well, second part of the question then, in the reading, there was a strange phrase, Dionysian piety.
Where was that?
It was in the first chapter, Nietzsche and Buddhism, in the book that included the the one that you
the Zen and self-overcoming one, you mean, or the Nietzsche and Buddhism?
I did, exactly that.
I mean, that's a very nice phrase, you know, and I imagine the writer, I don't think that's Nietzsche, maybe it is Nietzsche. Was he quoting, or is it just no? I mean, Dionysian piety is almost like a you know, being true to an idea of the Dionysian. It's a bit like, you know, acting like the rock star, like Ozzy Osbourne, always being completely out of your head. You know, it becomes a kind of piety in the end.
But there was a certain self-consciousness that comes with piety that didn't fit with the Dionysian.
It's a conflict, but then again, Ozzy Osbourne personifies it, doesn't he? Or has? You know, I mean, people who for whom that whole kind of world of sex, drugs, and rock and roll is almost like a piety, because you have to do it to live up to that kind of persona.
Yeah, but the having to bit doesn't really work with my conception of the Dionysian.
No, fair enough. Yeah, that might not quite work.
Yeah,
it's a clever phrase. I like it, but
it's just in all of the reading and all of this thinking. We keep bouncing up against opposites and paradoxes, and something from nothing, and all of this kind of stuff. And it just comes back to the what do we do with it then question.
Exactly, yeah. Well, Nietzsche would say we create art.
Yeah,
I mean,
but what he said that we should do with it is become the philosophers of the future.
Yeah. By
looking at the dim and distant Oriental past.
Yeah, well, maybe that's what we are doing. Maybe that's what Dan's doing by reading Simulation and Simulacra, becoming a philosopher of the future. Maybe a philosopher of the future is an artist.
Yeah, I think that Rauschenberg took an eraser to a de Kooning sketch.
Right.
That's the philosopher.
Did de Kooning know?
I don't know or care, actually. The point is that he elected to erase great art as an artist himself. And I think that's probably as close an idea or image as I've got of the philosopher of the future.
Right.
And the relationship between the creating and the making of nothing and the making of things.
Well, some would see that as kind of art vandalism, which has its own role. I guess it's a bit like Medina taking Dinos Chapman, buying
Yeah,
Goyas, original Goyas, and putting moustaches on
yeah,
them.
no, it wasn't done as an act of vandalism.
Right. I'm not sure the Chapmans viewed it as an act of vandalism, what they were doing.
No, and
Or Duchamp with his moustache on the.
I mean, the Chapmans, it wasn't vandalism because they weren't taking the originals. They weren't doing anything to the originals. They were just messing with copies, really. It's just kind of situationism, isn't it?
Well,
So,
we're not sure about that. I mean, they did actually buy the originals, some of the originals. I mean,
oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's intriguing.
Good.
But you know, Banksy shredded one of his own pieces recently. The minute that it was auctioned off, it suddenly started to destroy itself.
Yeah.
You know, I think that if there is a philosophy of the future, part of it has to involve the throwing away of philosophy as much as the deferring to philosophy.
Well, it depends on the story you tell. This is where Hegel took it. The idea that art was a part of the process leading to philosophy, which would lead into the absolute amalgamation of subject and object and absolute spirit. I mean, he has this extraordinary narrative about this. Art is a phase along the way for him, you know, after religion and before philosophy. Yeah. So the relationship between art and philosophy is complicated. Yeah, Alan?
I think philosophy is heading in the direction of a more world view, rather than a kind of European-centric one.
World philosophy is getting. I don't know if you got that link I put up, Peter Adamson's one, philosophy without gaps. It's very useful. You know, I've just dipped into it, but there's an attempt there to create a proper world philosophy, which links everything that could be recognizably philosophical. And of course, it raises the question of what do we mean by philosophy? You know, is art philosophy, as some people claim? Can anything be philosophy? Ultimately, what is it that defines philosophy as distinct from other things? I mean, I'd say it's thinking about thinking. You know, that's one way of looking at philosophy, but it's also about asking those big questions about the point of existence, or why is there something rather than nothing? Those kind of questions. There are ways in which you can define it, but you could do it through other things. You can express that desire or those questions through literature or art or music, perhaps. Maybe otherwise, I don't know.
If you so since we've been doing this, I've just there's a certain member of this forum who's advised me not to look at YouTube videos, and despite that good advice, I've been looking at loads of YouTube videos, and I've actually, if you type in the search term Nietzsche, and you get an incredible number of, or you can find Nietzsche and psychology, Nietzsche and religion, you know, anything.
In my defense, what I said
I didn't call you up by name.
As if it was going to be anybody else but me, right? In my defense, what I said was, get thee to an academic library and read a book, because the depth of the questions that you're asking, YouTube videos won't get you there.
That's where you're wrong, because that's what reminded me of the Derrida thing I was talking about earlier. I didn't know Charlie had put that link up, but I happened to be watching this guy, Rick. Has anyone heard of this Texan philosopher, Rick Rodin? Rick somebody.
Rick someone, no.
Well, I started watching the video. Yeah, it's just like a Texan drawl. You're expecting some sort of redneck hick, and the guy was actually very, very good.
Is he wearing a Stetson and stuff like that?
Don't take the piss. Anyway, it was actually very good, and I'd forgotten about that Derrida Nietzsche fragment thing, and he happened to mention it. So, you know, that's
yeah. I mean, Derrida's project is partly about finding the end of metaphysics. There's this big move in the 20th century to get to the end of metaphysics and get rid of metaphysics, whatever metaphysics might be. But Heidegger tries to end metaphysics. He claims that Nietzsche is the last metaphysician, and his metaphysical thing is the will to power. It is still metaphysical. It's about something other. You know, Nietzsche is constantly attacking Plato for creating other worlds that aren't this world. Same with Christianity, same with language in some cases. But in fact, he's done it himself with the will to power, according to Heidegger. So Heidegger tries to come along and find a way beyond that. Derrida claims that Heidegger's the last metaphysician and he failed. And Derrida is also trying to end metaphysics. In that period.
Sorry to interrupt.
He likes it.
Deleuze, your pal Deleuze, do people accuse him of being a metaphysician because he seems to have that whole life force thing, vitalism going on?
He's unashamedly a metaphysician. Yeah.
Okay.
He's not Deleuze, unlike so many of his contemporaries, is not afraid of being metaphysical. He's quite happy about being metaphysical. So yeah, he takes the concept of desire and desiring production, and clearly he's mashing up Nietzsche, Spinoza, and Bergson really in all kinds of ways, and various other things, and creating this new entity. Because Deleuze is about that force of creativity. It's the philosopher of the future, in the Deleuzean sense, is constantly creating concepts. That's what it's about, the creation of
becoming concepts. And all that business then.
And desiring production.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, I missed the last
it's about creating concepts. We can all do it. We can all.
Yeah, I heard that, but then you said something about production.
Sorry, desiring production.
Sorry?
Desiring production.
Desiring production.
Production of desire and desire producing at the same time. But in that, you know, Deleuze and Guattari, in their later book, What is Philosophy, distinguish between philosophy, science, and art as a question of velocities. They're all about producing something, but they produce at different speeds, which is a curious notion, perhaps. But something like science produces laws. So science is producing thought forms that move incredibly slowly. So a scientific law can last for millions of years, potentially. Whereas philosophy produces concepts which move a lot faster than scientific laws and functives.
How do we move, though? How does a concept move? I mean, it's just
through time. Through time, it evolves and changes. Well, and, you know, it's the rate of change, if you like. I mean, a concept can change. A concepts change according to who's talking about them. Concepts change according to their context.
And yet the metaphysical underpinning that philosophy just can't get rid of is moving even slower than Newtonian physics is, in my opinion.
In some ways. Yeah.
And what about art? Is that
art is fast? Art changes really, really quickly. You know?
So when we talk about art changing, do we mean one artist being influenced by another?
Well, that, but also the way it constantly transitioning, isn't it? Moving. I mean, that's true in modernity anyway.
So you're talking about
all the different schools of art that appeared in 100 years ago. And there's so many isms, weren't there? And there still are, really. But an artistic idea works with what they call an affect, which is a certain relationship we have with production, expression, whatever you want to call it. And it could be music, it could be literary, it could be painterly. And it's not intended to do the same thing as a concept or a scientific law. It has a different aim, effectively, to stimulate another part of our perceptual apparatus. But it's just as important.
There's not a lot of visual art that appeals to me.
There's not, did you say?
Not a lot of modern stuff really appeals to me, to be honest.
Well, that's a different issue. But it's about the creation of value. All of them are about the creation of value in some form. So, you know, that comes from Nietzsche. And value, I mean, the value of say, a work of art will change according to its context, who's looking at it, which particular period of history it's being looked at in. You know, I mean, why is Damien Hirst, say, contemporary artist, why is a Damien Hirst worth 20 million quid? You know,
because he addresses a new way of dealing with the void. So he kind of looks at the void as a kind of spiritual experience. So he kind of makes artwork that kind of where he says when he makes artwork, when he thinks about art, it's like a religion. Like his art is like his spiritual practice, but it's in a kind of response to his void.
I'd be interested to know what Damien Hirst would say about that. I mean, you know, well, he'd play it because that's what he does. He'd play that idea. I mean, I'd say that. I mean, that certainly lends itself quite well to a painter like Mark Rothko. I don't know if you know Mark Rothko, but there's someone who is concerned with voids and emptiness, and he creates very, you know, religious abstracts. And he ended up killing himself because he wanted to approach the void more directly. Or Malevich with his black square. Art has often dealt with that kind of concept of the void, usually through something very black. That's another story, but yeah.
Yeah, but the people you just mentioned, they're from some, you know, the first half of the 20th century, aren't they?
Yeah.
So since the 60s, Bridget Riley I really liked, and then after that, not really anyone.
But all of those artists are responding to the death of God. if you draw a line between quote unquote modern art and medieval art, the difference is the death of God, isn't it? We didn't have to draw black squares. We could just defer to God, and God would let us know what images would edify, and we would.
Yeah, well, in a Nietzschean sense, you could say you're moving from the camel to the lion. The death of God moves. You move from the camel, the beast of burden, to the lion, which is roaring in the face of nihilism. And so, in science is producing laws which enable technologies to develop. But art moves in a different direction. So if science is pursuing the will to truth, art is also pursuing a will to truth of a different kind, a truth of expression, perhaps. And in modernist art, and from a century ago, more or less, there's always this sense, or usually this sense, that this art has some meaning. It has some deep meaning. It's important. So when people go to art galleries, they're looking for some meaning within this. I mean, this is part of the discourse of art in that period, right up until the 70s, 1970s, when postmodernism, so-called, comes in. And it's okay to be completely meaningless. I mean, it's okay to be meaningless in the absurdism in a different way, but it no longer has to have that will to truth attached to it.
Isn't that
so,
akin?
will to truth and meaning creation?
Yeah.
Are they coming from the void? Why is it that we require rules, order, meaning, value, and where do we get it from, if not the void?
Well, Nietzsche would talk about generating values from that void.
Yeah,
that would be his version of the revaluation of all values, and maybe some people are doing that or trying to do it.
So if you talk about the modern artists from the Impressionists onwards up to whenever in the some part of the 20th century, an arguable point. That's akin to me. That's akin to people going to theatres as a replacement for going to churches. That's people still looking for meaning. They've accepted they don't have,
in an institutional sense, yeah.
Yeah, they've accepted they don't find meaning in God. They don't lost faith in God, so they're looking for it elsewhere. Looking for it in art, in literature, in theatre.
Well, in the 60s, there's an explosion of that. There's a real sense, you could argue, of the void moving through culture in the West in particular, and driving people to all kinds of excess.
but that's a kind of weak nihilism, isn't it?
Yeah.
What is it?
It would be viewed that way.
What did you say?
Weak nihilism.
Oh, weak nihilism.
Yeah. Just go with the flow, take what's offered.
There are artists who are kind of working against that grain, though.
I'm wondering what a strong nihilism would be like.
What? Strong? Well, no, go back to Bowie, because he seems to be in. I mean, who was it? One philosopher whose name I've completely forgotten now has written a book about Bowie and nothing, because the word nothing appears fairly constantly in Bowie's lyrics, and he's fairly obsessed with nothingness in a rather sophisticated way, I think.
I think that the will to power is meaningless.
Yeah. It's metaphysical. But then again, I mean, it depends. Again, it depends on the value you place on it. The will to power in one context might be viewed as the configuration of things that allow us to think. The will to power is not one thing. It's a whole mass of different forces. And the problem there is the name, the will, I can't remember the German, something to Matt. It suggests a singular will like Schopenhauer, but that isn't what Nietzsche intended, according to other theorists anyway. It's more like a mesh or a network of willing, going in all kinds of directions.
I think of it as being drives.
Drives, yeah.
That's easier to, except for the fact that we then kind of mix that up with the Freudian stuff. If you can kind of ditch
as
that,
people
then
did
drives
in the 60s, yeah.
is a better term, isn't it?
Yeah.
But as for whether the thing that drives us is external to us or not, what did Nietzsche say about that?
Well, I mean, then you get into the metaphors of external and internal, which Derrida has a lot of fun with.
Well, you get into the metaphysics again, don't you?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, what do we mean by inside and outside? Where does that come from, this concept? The human body, like skin.
I can tell you. Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about inside and outside.
Go on.
When I had paranoid schizophrenia when I was 21, the kind of the listening of the outside became the kind of the same as the listening on the inside. So the two, if that helps, the kind of two merged quite a bit, and then after a while the distinction just sort of kind of it just started becoming quite natural, just to kind of see the world as something that was just kind of not an exact copy as such, but I was trying to think of this. It was a direct relationship with what was going on the inside.
I mean, it's like what you're saying there really reminds me of the beginning of Anti-Oedipus, you know, where Deleuze and Guattari talk about what happens when a schizophrenic takes a walk. And they're writing at one point about Daniel Schreiber, who was the model for paranoia in Freud's work. He was a judge who, he had this wonderful idea of miraculating, where the sun really did shine out of his arse at some points. But he wrote this very beautiful diary about the whole process of going through what was then classified as paranoid schizophrenia, and Deleuze and Guattari try and turn that into philosophy. And they're inverting the skin. And Lyotard at the same time talks about the great ephemeral skin. The skin is both inside and outside in a curious way. Topologically speaking, human beings are a bit like a polo mint, you know. We don't really have an inside and outside, do we? Or do we? And we were both, aren't we? Or like a Mobius strip.
Well, here's a question for Dan, well, for all of us. Chi. Is chi inside or outside or both?
Don't believe in it.
We don't.
According to the whichever Asian, I mean, God, nearly all of them seem to have some kind of concept of chi, don't they? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that if you look at Chinese medicine and science today, it's all Western science, isn't it? There's no chi in their science.
But according to your reading, what is the traditional idea about chi? It is obviously a life force that exists within you, and in martial arts and in medicine, it's about directing chi around the body. But where is the origin of chi? Does it come into being when we're born, and does it dissolve away when you die?
It's supposed to be everywhere. It's all. It's everything. It's the fabric of the universe, I suppose. All the energy, everything that exists is chi or has chi flowing through it.
Okay.
Kind of,
That's a very, I mean, that permeates a lot of Western thinking as well. Like Druidism, they have their Arwen, which is like a life force that permeates everything. So you hug a tree and you can contact the Arwen of the tree, and it joins with your Arwen, and so on and so forth. So,
but the point with, say, for example, Tai Chi, is that because that's what I've done. There's all kinds of kung fu, but point of Tai Chi is it might be based. There may not be such a thing as chi, but if you practice Tai Chi regularly, you know, reasonably regularly and frequently, you will find that you are healthier and happier. And that's my experience and millions of others.
that's pragmatics.
So,
but I mean, you know, talk about chi and inside.
What I mean is, you don't need to acknowledge the existence of chi for that to be the case.
I mean, the metaphysical status of chi may be in doubt, but you know, there are a lot of forces around which, you know, we have to generally believe in, like electricity, for example.
I mean, I heard a story about who's the guy? The physicist, the nuclear physicist.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, the one who's worked. There was a big argument between. He had a former pupil, I think. There's a play about it which I've seen.
Oh, Heisenberg, is it?
Yeah, and the other guy.
Niels Bohr.
Yeah,
you're thinking about
thinking about Niels Bohr and the
Copenhagen.
Yeah. That's the play. That's a really good.
It's very good. Yeah.
And anyway, I heard a story about Niels Bohr had a horseshoe above his door in his office, and his friend said to him, "You don't believe in that, do you?" He said, "No, but they tell me it works whether you believe in it or not."
Yeah.
And I kind of like that. There's something about that.
Well, that's true of quantum mechanics as well.
Yeah.
You know, talking about mysteries, as Helen was earlier, I mean, you know, quantum mechanics is full of mysteries. The universe is full of mysteries because we don't understand them. But I mean, the concept of inside and outside is a topological problem, and I'm really interested in topology. You know, topology is like the shape of a donut. Human beings may be kind of like the shape of a donut, except we've got more holes, you know. How does one hole translate to another thing, and so on and so forth. And the idea of inside and outside seems to permeate our thinking. And this is Derrida's point, that we think about the world in terms of inside and outside. We think about our bodies in that sense. We think about countries in that sense. We think about our homes in that sense. And just as we think about up and down and left and right, you know, these are quasi objects in a way, but they have a real kind of importance to us. So
Well,
up and downness, upness and downness is related to heaven and hell, for example, and so on.
Yeah, I've been thinking about life recently, and trying to undermine the inside-y, outside-y stuff that you were just describing. And I've been looking at life as vivacious areas.
Right, okay. Flesh that out a bit. Yeah.
That the difference between things that are alive and things that aren't alive can be quite fuzzy and very temporary. The definition of life has to do with being able to self-reproduce, but it doesn't. Things can reproduce themselves without being alive. A clump of things that behave as if they are alive becomes an area of vivacity.
Right.
Okay. So the will to truth seems to me to be something that we could unpick using psychology. You know, why is it that we need truth and necessary fictions and everything else? But what is the will to power? What are those drives? Does it come back to my anecdote about the Monkey King? And, you know, in the beginning there were primordial forces. I mean, what does that mean for somebody who is fundamentally not metaphysical like myself? What am I to make of this external thing that acts on vivacious areas, turns alive places into places?
Well, okay, you're thinking inside and outside again, in a way. Spinoza, going back to Spinoza, would have had the idea everything is one, you know, univocal. It's all one energy force, and it has different modes and forms. It appears in a different sense and expresses in a different sense, but it's actually not different. Life is one, you know, physical movement is another, but they're both expressions of the same fundamental nature, right? So they're not actually distinct, and there's ultimately no inside or outside. But the thing that the mechanism behind that is, as far as Spinoza is concerned, for humans anyway, pleasure, pain, and desire, the only three forces that operate there. And the more power we have over our environment and our world, the happier we are, and the less power we have, the more painful things become, and the unhappier we are. And in a curious kind of way, that's how Spinoza views the universe, and particularly the human universe. So power is about happiness and pleasure.
But desire and happiness and pleasure, are they supposed to be external to the human being?
No,
they're
within us. They're expressed in the same way as, you know, a mental experience and a physical experience are parallels, but they're the same experience interpreted in a different modality, according to Spinoza. But it's all actually one thing happening at the same time. So one of the old problems in philosophy was whether a mental event and what happens in the brain physically are the same or are distinct. You know, it goes back to the 18th century, this idea. You know, there are people called eliminative materialists now, the Churchlands, this couple, who argue that everything is a physical event. There is nothing else but physical events. Anything else that we think is non-physical is an illusion. But others would say that's just reductive, because that doesn't actually explain the experience at all. Yeah, you might be able to actually map the experience of somebody falling in love or getting drunk or whatever, and possibly replicate it, but that doesn't actually cash out or explain the experience. Spinoza would say they're just parallel. They're just the same thing, expressing themselves in different ways.
This is what I was trying
that problem.
This is what I was trying to talk to you about when we had that argument about kung fu in the Matrix.
All right, yeah, okay.
Because, you know, I talked about this with Karen a bit, because, you know, your body, if you learn, I can see how you could learn a language overnight, maybe, because that's purely intellectual, mental stuff happening in your mind.
Mhm.
But for you to learn Kung Fu, you need your nerves, and ligaments, and tendons, and muscles, all of your bodily functions to be functioning in a way that can fulfill what it needs to do.
Right.
Yeah, but you're talking about a world where people can dodge bullets. So physical
Oh yeah, the
rules
Matrix.
don't apply, right? I think the minute that you start looking to the Matrix to prove or disprove anything, you're on really shaky ground.
Forget the Matrix. It's just the point that the concept that you could learn Kung Fu from some sort of app or some kind of connect yourself to some kind of, that you can't, your body needs to develop to do certain, you can't be a sprinter, you can't learn that online, or a weightlifter, you can't learn these things online.
Well, that relates to my point about Buddhism. You'll actually delay your learning anything if you start reading books about Buddhism.
Well, that's
Anyway, so I want to maybe write something this time, because
okay. Well, if anybody wants to do an assignment, just message me, email me. But
Okay.
as ever, nobody has to do it, and if people want to, then we can.
I just want to do something quite short, because
Sure.
I've not
Do a poem if you want.
written about philosophy before. I recently saw, I don't know where I saw this, someone said to be a philosopher, you don't have to know anything, you just need to be reasonably intelligent and interested, and I think that's me. So, but I don't know how to write. I've read loads of bits of philosophy. But
Well, the best way to learn is by reading philosophers.
Yeah, but I was
Right.
trying to write something now, and then you can tell me what I've got wrong.
Okay.
So
You have to work out what you want to write about, though.
yeah, or would you
I'm
suggest?
not going to give you questions. You
Okay.
work out your own question.
This is the ongoing conversation I've been having with Dan. What is your subject? What is your focus? What is your question? Because nobody can help you or respond to you until you've pinned that down.
You've got to make a question.
I sent you, I think, a video with sort of my comments on it, and what I thought I understood from it. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. Matt said he'd get back to me, but he was away at the Stones.
Right.
He hasn't got back since he's returned
Yeah,
to Brighton.
I haven't looked at it. No, I haven't looked yet.
But
Well,
it was an overview of a field. You just said, I'm interested in this field.
I didn't. I said that I identified 3 strands of linguistic ideas, 3 strands that Searle points out, and that this is what I thought I'd understood by what they were saying.
That's fine, yeah, but if you're going to write an essay, what are you going to do with that?
I thought something might help me to develop, might see what I was talking about and say whether they thought I had what I had written, that I thought I had heard John Searle say that these 3 particular people, one of whom is Chomsky. This is what I think he said about these 3 ways of looking at language, and I was kind of hoping someone would say, yes, you were right about the one, perhaps not the other. Or if you had any comments.
It's very difficult until you actually get something a bit more concrete down, though.
All right, yeah.
It could be a bit longer. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be rigidly philosophical, but
I mean, I know it's not really your area of interest, is it?
what, Chomsky?
Language, linguistics.
I think that's more John Thornton.
Well, I said, John was on the emailed me the following day the same evening, to set up a Zoom meeting the following day.
Yeah, it's his thing. It's his area. Yeah.
And also, but it turned out he just wanted to talk about, he knew the people, he knew John Searle.
Right.
And he wanted to talk about his days at Oxford.
Well, this is it. The Free University of Brighton doesn't work like other universities, does it?
No. And there are
anyway, look, I'm gonna have to go and eat now. So thank you, Dan, Karen, Dawn, Helen, Federico, for lasting right to the end as we're about to slip into the void. But no doubt we'll be in communication again very soon anyway.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks.
So yeah, Nietzsche isn't over, it's just started.
Yeah, well, Nietzsche's never over. He will eternally recur, won't he?
He will, exactly. Yes. That's all this session.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. It's been a completely gripping and mind-blowing course. It really has. Fun. And thank you, everybody else, for your part in it.
Yeah.
Okay,
guys, I'm going to switch you off if you want to talk to each other. Find other ways.
All right. See you all.
Bye.
Bye.